Welcome, I'm Denise Graves, and you're watching Opera America's Oral History Project.
Jay Lesenger, thank you so much for being with me today.
Great to be here,
As you
Marc.
know, we are interviewing 50 people in celebration of our 50th anniversary, 50 folks who've made just a really sizable contribution to American opera over the last half century. And you are certainly one of those people, and we really wanted to talk to you. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. That's a great honor, Marc. I appreciate it.
Jay, I always ask, who brought you to your first opera?
My father did. I was fortunate enough to grow up very close to the city. I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, which is in those days only 20 minutes into the city. And my parents had a subscription to the Metropolitan Opera for over 25 years. Dead center orchestra, row M. And my father took me to my first opera when I was 9. It was Fanciulla del West. What I remember about it was that the chorus was as wide as they were tall. And I thought it was the silliest story I'd ever seen, and I loved it. And
So silly, but you loved it.
absolutely. And I had been listening to opera before that. I discovered classical music kind of, well, my parents loved music and theater and took us to concerts. And when I was in, I think, 2nd or 3rd grade, our teacher played Eine kleine Nacht music for us. And I just thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I ran home, told my mother about it, and bless her heart, she went out and bought me the LP, the recording, which I still have. And I think that was kind of the beginning for me. I mean, I've always loved music and opera. And as I said, Dad took me to see Fanciulla, and then usually I would go to the things my mother didn't want to see because they'd seen something so many times. And as she always used to say, she didn't like modern opera. So I did get to see things like The Last Savage of Menotti and Rosenkavalier when I was in high school, just blown away by it. I was very lucky. And then, of course, we went to the theater all the time as well.
So you didn't have to slowly acquire a taste for opera. From your first experience, you loved it.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
How did you find your way into stage direction?
Well, I knew that I loved opera and theater. I wanted, I'm in college, of course, in high school, I toyed with the idea of being an actor. I was in the high school shows a few times. And then I went to Hofstra out on Long Island because they had a very, very good theater department and because it was close to the city, which I really wanted. But my parents were not that happy about the idea of me going into theater as a profession. As they said, it was an avocation, not a vocation. So I kind of did a lot of different things. And in college, I thought I was going to be a psych major. That lasted about a week. I thought I was going to be a music teacher. That maybe lasted 2 weeks. And I was very active with the theater department just as a volunteer. And then in my junior year, I remember sitting with a catalog and saying, all right, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? By then I was very aware that there was such a thing as an opera director. And I knew what directors did because I watched my teachers directing plays. And I literally shifted. I went from a BS to a BA so I could take a minor in theater. I think by that point, my parents were resigned to let me do that. And then I had a stroke of incredible luck my senior year. I directed my first opera when I was a junior. I got a bunch of friends together and we put on Trouble in Tahiti.
And pause for 1 second. At Hofstra or?
At Hofstra.
Okay.
At Hofstra.
And how did you choose the Trouble in Tahiti?
Yeah. Actually, a friend of mine had introduced it to me. He knew the show and gave me a recording of it. And I figured, well, it's a small cast, simple scenic elements. And so I asked permission from the theater department to use the black space for a while, and they gave me a few days in there, and so we did it. And the mezzo, not the mezzo was the lead, but in the trio was a woman named Sally Stunkel, who also went on to become an opera director for a while. I know. Anyway, I did that, and then in my senior year, I took a conducting class because I thought if I want to be a director, maybe I should know what a conductor does. Also, I was going to conduct, believe it or not, the college musical, which was Once Upon a Mattress. Don't ask. I learned a lot from the experience, one of which is I'm not really a conductor, but I took this conducting class, and this is the man I think I owe everything to. His name was Don Lusader. Don had been a coach for a while at City Opera, and he was brought in for one semester to teach this conducting class because the regular teacher was on sabbatical. So the first day he went around the room and asked everybody what they wanted to be. And everybody in the class were music education majors, because that's pretty much what Hofstra turned out of the music department, except for my very good friend who was a wonderful accompanist. She said she wanted to be a coach accompanist. And then he got to me last and I said, well, I want to be an opera director. And he said, well, what are you doing in this class? I said, well, I think I should know a little bit about conducting if I'm going to do opera, you know? And he said, well, do you know a man named Frank Crissaro? And I said, well, yes. I mean, you know, Frank was the famous director of the 70s and late 60s and 70s at City Opera, along with, of course, Tito Capobianco. I said, I know who he is. I've gone to see productions he's directed. And he said, well, you know, he's got a workshop in New York. Why don't you give him a call and maybe, and he said to the class, is he any good? Has he ever directed anything? He said, oh yeah, he did Trouble in Tahiti last year and it was really good. I'm not sure that was true, but I appreciate my my fellow students' enthusiasm. So he gave me Frank's number, and I was petrified. I mean, the idea of calling Frank Crissaro on the phone, you know, when I was like, well, I don't know, 19 or 20 at the time. And oh no, he didn't give me the number then. I ran into him in the cafeteria a few days later, and I said, you mentioned Frank Crissaro's workshop. Oh, he said, yeah, let me give you his number. I got it with me, gave it to me. He said, just give him a call, you know, see what happens. Well, I never saw this man again. He was only at the school for a couple of weeks. There was a family tragedy of some kind, and he had to withdraw, and they had to get somebody else to teach conducting class. If I had not stopped Don in that moment in the cafeteria, you and I probably wouldn't be talking.
Wow.
So
isn't that just kind of
an
incredible intervention?
Kismet, or as we say in Jewish, b'shert. There's no question.
And tell me Don's last name again.
It was Lesenger. I think Lesader, Lusader.
Wow.
And I had the good fortune some years later to run into him backstage somewhere in an opera somewhere, and I think he was the chorus master, maybe in the Newark Opera or something. And I made a point of going backstage, and of course he didn't remember me, but I said, I just want you to know you changed my life, you know. So I started going to Frank's. Oh, well, it took me about.
Did you call Frank on the phone?
It took a few weeks. I'm not a drinker. I should have been. It would have helped. But it took me a few weeks to get the chutzpah to give him a call, and I did. And I got Frank, and you know Frank. So he says, yeah, sure, come on in. It's 58th Street, 58th Street Studios, you know, and told me how much it cost. And he was doing it to make a little extra money on the side. So every Saturday, my senior year, from then on, I drove in the city and I sat in his workshop for 3 hours. And then in the afternoon, I'd rush up to the tickets booth and I'd get something for the afternoon. And then I'd have a McDonald's and then I'd get something for the evening. It could be a ballet, an opera, a musical, 2 musicals, 2 operas, whatever it was. I would go to 2 performances every Saturday. And I sat in Frank's class for a number of weeks in the back. It was very shy, and there were all these crazy singers. And by the way, Lou Galterio was in the class at the time, and David, what is his name at Virginia Opera? David Marks, I forget.
Peter Marks.
Not Peter Marks. David Farrar, if you know that name. He was a director. He was there, but there was a number of directors that were just kind of getting started in the workshop. So I'd watch Frank work with singers, and then he would, of course, other directors would bring in little scenes, which he would critique. And one day there was a soprano who'd come in to sing an aria from La Serva Padrona. And the guy who was supposed to play the mute, Butler, didn't show up for class. And Frank said, is there anybody who knows Serva Padrona? And I don't know why I knew Serva Padrona, because like, who cares? But I did. And I said, yeah, I kind of know what's going on. He said, well, get up here and improvise with her. So I got up and I improvised the scene with her while she was singing the aria. The place cracked up. And he figured that this was a setup. He said, you guys have been rehearsing this together, haven't you? I said, no, first time I'm meeting her. And he said, well, what are you doing? You've been sitting in the back there. You need to do some scene work. So, and he put me together with some singers. And I started doing scene work with him. It was life-changing, of course, to do that. I mean, just what I learned. And then at that point, I applied to Indiana University and got in there, which was good in many ways. It gave me a number of incredible opportunities. I studied with Hans Busch there, who was the son of Fritz Busch. Hans was very old school, but he was very generous to me. I was stage managing La Boheme, and one day I came in for the chorus rehearsal of Act 2, and he turned to me and he said, "Jay, why don't you stage this?" Having given me no warning whatsoever he was going to do that. I now have 75 to 100 students in front of me. Thankfully, the opera was in English, and I did know Bohème. And suddenly I'm helping stage the second act of La Bohème. I mean, it was unbelievable. So very early on, I got a gift, which was how to work with large crowds, which I think is something you have got to know as a director in opera. And I unfortunately don't think a lot of people get that experience.
So let me pause for a second there. It's great that we're up to Indiana University. We'll pick it up there. You mentioned Frank Corsaro and Tito Capobianco as kind of the directors of the day in that decade of the 70s. What made them important in their day? What made Frank Corsaro important as a stage director in his day?
Well, you know, it's so interesting because they were absolutely at opposite ends of the spectrum from the kind of productions they turned out. But Frank came out of the acting studio in New York, and he brought that with him, the sense of how he worked with the performer to get the small details out. He did a lot of conceptual work. I mean, he did a Madame Butterfly, and I think he actually was one of the first people to ever have her in Western style hair in the second, you know, she cut her long hair and had a bob. He was the first one to really be doing cinema, using film. His productions of Romeo and Juliet, the Country Romeo and Juliet, is that the one? I can't remember now the title. It's an English opera. And, but he did that. And then Metropolis Affair, of course, with video, which was brilliant. I mean, film, which was brilliant. Frank, I mean, so he was very controversial. The first person to have nudity on stage. He did Popea, and the Popea was naked in the bathing scene, you know. And I think what happened with Frank, unfortunately, is he got to a point where he was competing with himself to be more and more sensational. So he got more and more sensational as he went on. And I worked with Frank. I mean, when I got to City Opera, which is the next part of the story, I was assigned to his productions. And then I met Tito Capobianco while I was there. And Tito had a sense of style like no one. I mean, just elegant. He worked a lot with his wife, Gigi Denda, who was a choreographer. So she dealt with a lot of the movement. But his sense of kind of the bigger picture was, you know, there was no one else like him, I think. Of course, he did a lot of work with Beverly Hills. And he taught me, well, actually I learned this elsewhere, but the idea that you, first of all, know everybody's name in the chorus when you start rehearsing with them. But I got to watch him work with large groups, and he was brilliant at it, how he worked with a chorus. So I was getting incredible input from two great opera directors at the time, you know, from
Wow.
Frank and from Tito. And they were both very generous to me, frankly. I don't know how much to skip ahead or keep going with.
So, okay, so we can close that window for a second on Frank and Tito for the moment. So there you are, Indiana University. You're working in a Bohème with a big chorus, getting some good experience. Right. But then how did it go from there?
Well, IU was interesting for me at the time. In some ways, I mean, I had been in Frank Corsaro's workshop, and it wasn't going to be very much. It was going to equal the experience of being there. But as I said, Hans was very generous to me. I assisted him, I think, on all the productions he did while I was there. I got to work on Dr. Faust, you know, get to know Dr. Faust while I was there. And then he was working, he was doing Tales of Hoffman, and he let me choreograph the doll aria, which he loved. And then we were doing Eugene Onegin, which was a revival. I had not been there for the first time they had done it. It's now 4 or 5 years later, but there was a little contretemps, shall we say, between the opera program and the opera department and the dance department. So the dance department refused to dance in the production. This is Eugene Onegin with 5 major dance sequences. And he turned to me and he said, can you put this together? And I said yes to anything. I was young. You know, so I said, sure, I can do that. I know how to Polonaise. I'll figure the rest of it out. And I had to literally get a group of like 24 friends, most of whom had never danced before, by the way, on a very steeply raked stage. And, you know, we rehearsed like mad, and I did the best I could. I'm sure everybody else thought it was terrible, but, you know, there were 5 dance sequences when that curtain went up. And actually somebody from the ballet department did come and watch rehearsal, they were actually very nice and made some suggestions. Hans was very happy, and I think the students did a great job, So what a learning experience. You don't get a chance like that. Thankfully, they don't give people like me a chance to do that in professional situations. But to have a chance in college to stretch myself that way was invaluable. So I did my 2 years there. I directed a one-act opera called Lord Byron's Love Letter. And you and I have talked, I'm not going to go into it in great detail right now, but there's also there's both nature and nurture that got me to opera. The nature we're going to save for another interview. But it turns out that there is a kind of genetic operatic connection in my background, which is very important. But I directed Lord Byron's Love Letter because it was an opera that nobody else knew. It was an American one-act based on a Tennessee Williams play. That was my thesis, as it were. And then I left, and I was lucky because while I was there, I met Carolyn Lockwood, who was Hans Busch's wife. She was the production stage manager at Santa Fe, and I did go to Santa Fe for summer as an assistant stage manager. And there was, again, that was my first real big professional job, and it was quite a learning curve. And then I had a year of floundering around in New York, typing like everybody else, and I did apply to City Opera, and I was granted an interview by Felix Popper. And he couldn't have been nicer. I remember that interview, again, very important to me because I put together a pretty good resume for somebody who was like 23 or 24 at the time. I mean, I'd studied French and German and Italian a little bit. I was very familiar with the repertory because I loved opera. So all I did was listen to a lot of operas. I went constantly. And he said to me after the meeting, this is one of the most complete resumes I've ever seen for somebody applying for this, for somebody your age. So I had to wait a little while, but about 6 months or a year later, I can't remember the timing, I got a call from Felix, and he offered me a job as director on the staff. And I was the youngest assistant director ever to join the staff. I think I was 24. I wasn't even quite 25 when I joined.
Wow. Jay, can you tell me the year there? About the year?
I started there in fall of '76. Because I was in Aspen that summer I was in Aspen as a stage manager. And then literally the day after that closed, I had my first meeting in room 2 at New York City Opera. And by the way, I brought out my cup for you.
Oh, how fabulous. Those are the days. I didn't get to City Opera until 1980. So you beat me there by 4 years. Well, Jay, what was City Opera like in those days?
Oh my gosh. Very different from what it ended up being. We were producing 11 different productions in 11 weeks each season. In those days, it was a fall season and a spring season, and of course, 2 or 3 weeks of rehearsal before that. So every week there was something else opening. I worked as an assistant on 6 productions a season. And that was my first introduction. I mean, I worked with, one of the first shows I worked on was Pelléas and Melisande, the second assistant, with Frank. And in fact, a few years later, when it came back in the repertory, I was the only one there who knew it. And I put the show back together for Frank. I worked on Rigoletto with Frank. And then we also had my first experience with a company strike. My first fall season, there was a big company strike, and the company was out of work for 3 weeks until that got settled. I learned a lot from that. And then I guess it must have been maybe the second year. Well, I will tell you, I had a difficult first year. There was also, unfortunately, a death. My brother was diagnosed with cancer that fall and passed away in '77, in 10 months. So that was all hanging over my family and myself while I was working at City Opera, and long days, dealing with what was going on at home. And I was second assist on everything. I mean, I never had a chance to do anything but move furniture around. And apparently somebody questioned whether I should be in that position or not. I know who it is. I will never name them, but privately we'll talk. And I got called in and told basically I was being put on probation. And I said to Felix, I haven't had a chance to do anything. I was second assistant on 6 productions. I just sat there. And he said, I know. And I talked with Julius about that, Julius Friedel, who's the head of the company. And I told him, you've had a difficult year and this. So we are going to make sure you are assigned to Julius's productions next year. And you're going to work with him. You'll be in the room with him. And I owe a lot to Felix for that. So, and I was given a 1-season contract, just the fall. So I was assigned, that was when I remember the Pelléas revival, and I had to put it back together again. And it was also the season they were doing Il Turco in Italia, the Rossini opera, with Beverly, a new production, gorgeous production, with Tito and Gigi. And because Julius was conducting it, they assigned me to that production. So, Julius got to see me work. I got along wonderfully, I would say, with Tito and Gigi. They were very generous to me. And we laughed a lot, and I learned a lot. And then I had to put the Pelléas back together again. And Frank was kind of notorious for not coming to blocking rehearsals. When there was another production, when the revival would happen, he wanted the assistant to lay that all out, and then he would come and really work to connect the dots, as it were. And so I put the show together, and Frank was very complimentary. He thought it was well prepared. And then we had a stage rehearsal. And there had been a snafu in the rehearsal department, and they forgot to call the child, the Ignolde, to the rehearsal, and it was one of his scenes. By the way, that Pelléas is definitive as far as I'm concerned. It's the only time I've seen Pelléas that, to me, worked, because he didn't treat it like an impressionistic opera. He treated it like a real drama, and it just popped off the stage. It was incredible. So there was a bit of a tiff. Julius was not happy, and we ended up having a meeting, and all the staff, and for some reason he didn't blame me, thank God. And at a later rehearsal, I was down at the pit rail, and Frank and Julius were talking, and it was something I had to ask Frank. And Julius looked up at me, and he patted my cheek. He said, "You're doing a very good job." Next break, I was in Felix's office. I said, "Felix, Julius just patted me on the cheek, said I'm doing a good job." He said, "Don't worry about it. You've got your spring contract. You're going to be just fine." So that was my trial by fire.
Wow.
Yeah. But here was a chance not only to work with the two of them, but John Cox came through there. John Copley, wonderful English directors. Jerry Friedman, who I ended up assisting a little bit later on one of his shows for the acting company. There were just, you'd be in a place where there were not always 11 directors, because some things were revivals and they were being put together by the staff, but usually 4 or 5 directors were running around downstairs, and different conductors, and of course the amount of singers that came through the house at that time. So you just met so many people, watched so many people work in different ways, and there was no money to do any of this. They were always wondering if we were going to close. And the other thing was, in those days, the assistant director did everything in the room. We were the stage managers. We set it up. We took all the notes, the prop lists, who was going to do what. And then when we got to the stage rehearsal, we had to have this all typed up. This is way before computers, so you have a lot of whiteout. And you would hand the paper to the stage manager, and they would take over from there and hand out the information to the prop people. But you ran around those stage rehearsals, coordinating everything backstage. So it was a whole, but I am so happy for that.
Right.
It gave me a sense of how to organize myself as a director that I think is invaluable in opera. You cannot be well organized. There's not enough time to waste, So I was, great experience. The stress of, are we going to survive? Always. The amount of repertory that was going through the company in those days.
I wanted to focus on, on that span of repertoire, because as a stage director in your, great career doing hundreds of productions, it's Mozart to John Corigliano. It is European opera and American opera. Was your approach as a director always the same, or was it a different approach? New work versus inherited work, American work versus European work?
Well, I think with European work, you have to be aware of what went before. I do think the tradition is really important. You bring that in. With a newer work that may not exist. And then there's, of course, American work, which has already been produced, like The Ballad of Baby Doe or Susanna, which are existing, as opposed to working on an opera that's being done for the first time. So I worked with Thea Musgrave. I did the premiere of her new opera Pentalva down in New Orleans. Well, I was with her and the conductor on that from the first days. In fact, I was the one who had suggested the subject to the head of the company at the time, saying this would make a great, because it was a New Orleans subject, this would make a great historical opera. And he indeed commissioned it, and Thea composed it. So, we did a workshop of it a year before, and we wrestled with libretto with her, because she did both libretto and the composition. So that's one thing. Then if you're working on an American opera, certainly the American operas of the 50s and 60s, which tended to be relatively tonal, most of them, I think those I approached as standard repertory in a way, because I think they were based on that model of what European opera had been. Vanessa is very much a European connected. In fact, it was criticized for being too European when it premiered. And I don't know what that means in a way, because opera to me is opera. It's telling the story through singing, and through the emotion of music. So I think I pretty much tried to. As a director, I do not impose a concept on a piece. For me, whenever I've done conceptual work, and I have done some of that, I tend to be a more naturalistic director, and I'm proud of that fact, frankly. But if I do conceptual work, it has to come out of the piece. If it's not appropriate for the piece, I'm not going to glom on a concept because there's one scene that really works well in that train station. I want it to be, it has to be cohesive from beginning to end. So I think as I said, I think my approach has been building on a very solid foundation of my experience, my love of opera, and always approaching, well, most important, the music is it. The music has to be where you start. Even if the libretto is weak, the music's the most important thing.
Your biography says that you're known for your honest productions, and I pull that out. So I want to hear what does that mean? What does it mean to be known for honest productions?
Well, there's a lot of dishonest productions out there. I go to see stuff and I'm like, really? That's the idea you came up, that you heard the music, you read the story, and that's where you went with it. Now, there's some people who, of course, do brilliant conceptual work, of course. But so much of the time, as I said, I will see a production where like there's one scene that idea really works in that scene, and then the rest of the evening, they're struggling to make that work as a cohesive thing. So again, the idea of being honest, of starting with the music, starting and understanding that every composer's way of expressing an emotion is different. So the way Mozart expresses love versus Puccini versus Wagner versus Strauss, they're all expressing love. They're just doing it with a different vernacular. And you have to know what that vernacular is. You have to understand. I was lucky. I started early. I studied music when I was very young. I was a very bad pianist, and I went to become a very bad clarinetist, and I went on to be a really, really bad bassoonist. But I can read a vocal score.
And of course, that's leading to being a really bad conductor.
And that led to being a really bad. Well, I didn't do so bad. It was a musical. It was Once Upon a Mattress. I knew the show very well. I could beat time. Actually, but I realized being in the pit on that show, I do not ever want to be here again. So I would say I turned into a mediocre conductor, and then went on. I hope to become. I'd like to believe a good director.
So you've worked with Beverly Sills, and you've worked with students at Manhattan School of Music.
Right.
Is there a difference?
Yes, a bit. I was fortunate enough to work on a few productions that Beverly was in. Louise, I assisted on them. I didn't direct Beverly, but Beverly was incredibly generous in rehearsal. I have found that the people right at the top generally are never a problem in rehearsal. They're professionals. They bring professionalism. It's the ones who may slightly be just below.
Bruce Donnell, in my interview with him, said the exact same thing. That in all of his years of working with the greats at the Met, that they were always early for rehearsal, sitting there just waiting to be called on as needed be. That they never had a problem with the superstars.
Right. But it's the people who are just below who are insecure, and that's where you run into problems occasionally. Beverly, funny, came in. Brilliant musician, of course, great singer. I still remember the first time I was in rehearsal with her. It was this revival. remounting a production of Louise that had been in the old house on, in the city center. Pretty crappy looking set and everything, but Beverly wanted to do it on stage because she was going to record it. Didn't want to record it until she had done it in the theater. And it was John Alexander and Franny Bible and who was it was John Alexander and Robert Hale was the father. So it was a wonderful cast. Julius decided he would direct it himself. And then of course, when the big chorus, scenes came, that wasn't working. So one of the house directors stepped in to work on that. And then Frank actually came in and worked on some of the book scenes, the family scenes. But Beverly was nothing fazed her in rehearsal. And I remember in Turco and Italia, my job was, of course, to be with her, before, any artist making a major entrance, you're always there with them in case they need anything at the last minute. And I remember I don't know what we were chatting about. And the music's kind of the end, the entrance for her entrance music started. She opened her umbrella, turned, walked out on stage, started singing without missing a beat. She was amazing. I love, I will say that I had the great honor of pushing her on stage for her last bow, because Tito commissioned an opera from Menotti called La Loca, based on a really interesting Spanish play about the daughter of Isabel and Fernando, and everything, terrible history. She was treated terribly. And so I was in San Diego when the production was first done, San Diego Opera with Tito. And then we brought it to New York. And Tito did not want to be at the final performance because he knew it was her last. But I'm tearing up a little bit right now thinking that. It's very emotional. I mean, Beverly was so iconic in the opera world in those days. And but he didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be there for her last bow. And he said to me, "You make sure she have last bow. You make sure." So I stood in the wings, and there was been a full, that full rank. Everybody, all the solo calls in front of the curtain. Then everybody got out in the line. They all came out. Beverly came off, and I said, "You got to go out again." She said, "No." I turned and just pushed her through that curtain. I said, "You have to, otherwise Tito's going to kill me." And I just pushed her, and she went out. So she got the last bow, last solo bow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how is it different working with students at a conservatory?
Well, the one thing about students is their incredible eagerness, which is so wonderful and so rewarding. Now, many of them don't have the skills yet. That's what they're there for. And I have to say, I love working in that situation as well. It's very rewarding. At the same time, it's frustrating because with an artist, somebody who's established, you can throw out a certain set of ideas and then they will start to build on them on their own, make it their own. With singers, unless you have a particularly gifted one, and there are some who've had enough experience that they are, you have to keep prodding them along and give them a lot of the specifics. But it's so wonderful to see when the light goes on, when you get to the run through, when they finally get to do it from beginning to end. And they start to put it together and go, "Oh, that's why Jay wanted me. Oh, now I see. That's why the conductor asked for it, and it's really so gratifying." And, I had the experience a few weeks ago of going to see the opera version of Intimate Enemies. That's Fontalba novel, Intimate Apparel. And there were 5 members of that cast that I had worked with in one way or the other. 1 or 2 of them had been at my young artist program at Chautauqua. The rest of them, I think, had been at Manhattan School of Music. And to see 5 young people who are out in the world I can't tell you how good that made me feel. Now, I can't take credit, of course, full credit for the Manhattan kids. Somebody else picked them. But, the kids from Chautauqua, that was their first professional experience.
Yeah.
And Stephen Osgood, who's conducting that, or was conducting that, of course, is now taking my position at Chautauqua Opera. So we waited for him to come out. The 5 singers were there. I mean, it was, as happy as I think I've ever been, to see that.
Oh, how wonderful,
Yeah.
Jay. Now, you mentioned Chautauqua, and here you have been a stage director, a conductor for a short while. You wrote a repertoire.
You have to stop bringing that up.
And
I'll put it down.
I'm gonna add it into your record.
No,
here.
it's fine. It's fine.
There you are. You find yourself a general director. And
Well,
was that trial by fire?
Oh God, was it ever? I had I was at City Opera for 6 years on the staff. I was very fortunate. When Beverly took over the company, she decided she wanted to open with Anna Bolena, which had been one of her great vehicles. I had seen it when I was in high school, but I didn't remember anything about it. And one day, I guess it was Gigi and Tito called me, pulled me over, and they said, "You're going to have a meeting with Beverly. Just be ready." And I went into Beverly's office. She said, "How would you like to do a new staging of Anna Bolena for opening night of her first season?" I was 28, maybe 29, I can't remember. And I, of course, was flabbergasted. Tito didn't want to stage a revival of that without her. He'd done it twice with her, three times maybe. Gigi, the same thing. So she gave me the sets, the costumes. Sam Raimi doing his first Henry VIII. Rockwell Blake was the Percy, the tenor. Susie Marcy was a great mezzo stalwart, of course, at City Opera, had worked many times with Beverly. And Olivia Stapp making a return to the company as a soprano after she'd left 10 years before as a mezzo, which was an interesting experience, but very exciting. And here I am making my debut. And frankly, I hadn't done that much as a director at that point. And in fact, that was, no, I was already scheduled that fall to go to San Diego to direct Werther. Tito had given me, he said, "I want to give you an opportunity. I'm going to give you the big show now. You're going to do Werther." So I thought this is going to be my big step forward as a director. I got a whole production. And then Beverly asked me to do the Bolena. So my real debut as a director, fully in control, as it were, or not in control of production, was opening night of Beverly Hill's first season as general director. No pressure at all, not a bit, and it went pretty well. Olivia was a very interesting artist. The Met was on strike, so all the opera crazies came to see the opening night. All of the nuts from the upper reaches of the Met, bless their hearts, all the opera aficionados. And she was like Callas reincarnated on stage. She very much was in that style. But then you had Sam, singing the bejesus out of Rocky Blake and Susanna. I mean, great cast. Chorus was wonderful. And the Times review, yeah, but I got a great review in the Post. I mean, I got some very good reviews and some nice feedback from people in the company.
So good, but we're going on to Chautauqua as general director. So connect these dots.
So now I decided, after being there for 6 years, I had done some revivals. I had did a new staging of Magic Flute, and then I realized that was about as far as I would go in the company until I got out and established myself. Went off to start doing freelance work. I'm now in my early 30s, and I'm starting to work regionally. Ended up teaching at the University of Michigan for 3 years, which I'm glad I did. That's really where I started to get to work with young people, and I learned so much by the process and drew so much on what I learned from Frank about how to work with actors and singers. And by the way, a little aside note to that, I always assumed, of course, that professional singers would come in with all the tools, but very often they don't, because they haven't had acting classes in their conservatories. They're learning on the go too. And going back to teach, when I stopped that, and when I was still doing regional work all through that, I approached my work with professionals a little more in detail. I didn't just assume things. I gave them, I hope, a stronger foundation to work on, because I realized some of them just needed that. Mm-hmm. So I taught there for 3 years, or 4 years, and I realized academia was not ultimately the place for me. And went back to doing regional work, and I was down in North Carolina doing a butterfly, and I got a call from Marty Merkley, who was the head of programming at Chautauqua. He said, "Your name's been given us as a possible candidate. We need a new head of our opera company. My predecessor was leaving." And he asked if we could come down. And I said, "Well, why don't you fly down? I'm doing Madame Butterfly. You'll see the production, and we can talk," which we did. And then then they called and asked me to come up and meet with the powers that be. And I met every vice president. And I was called in to meet the head of religion, which scared the heck out of me. I thought, oh my God, he's going to try to convert me. But it turns out he was an opera lover. He just wanted to know what the name of a good opera book was. And we got to be very good friends after that. And suddenly I was told, I got a call from the president of Chautauqua a week later saying, "How would you like to run our opera company?" I said, sure. And like I had done when I was conducting and when I made my directing debut, I said, of course I can do that. Of course. You know. But I remember during the interview process, I spent a couple of nights by myself in the 400-bed dormitory. I had only the most luxurious of accommodations for my interview. And and I was sweating bullets. I thought, oh my God, I want to direct productions, of course, but oh my God, I have to do this and this and this and this and this. And I just wasn't sleeping. I was tossing and turning. And then I had a brilliant idea. I'll hire somebody to do some of those things. I'll get a production manager. It suddenly occurred to me, okay, that's right. These are the things you have to do. And, you know, it was a little scary, but I was very lucky. I got put together a pretty good team because actually when my predecessor left, a lot of people kind of took that as their opportunity to move on to other things too. So I had almost a clean slate. And we'll say one of the smartest things I ever did, Carol Rausch, who was the chorus master there at the time and had been there for a number of years, I asked her to take over as music administrator. And I think so much of our success during my years there was because of Carol. You know, she was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Brilliant. So suddenly I am staging 3 operas out of 4 for the first season. I'm typing up the program in my office at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, I wasn't at the auditions for there was no on-site auditions for the Young Artist program. They sent me hundreds of resumes that I had to comb through to pick the young artist. I mean, it was overwhelming. But, you know, again, I'm going to get choked up. The opening night of Hoffman was really something. I mean, Tales of Hoffman, which is a killer piece to do. And oh my gosh, I had Stella Zambales, a wonderful soprano she did all the roles. Randy Locke, rest his soul, was the Hoffman. Michael Devlin, I believe, if I remember back, was my villain. I had a very good cast. And a wonderful production by Erhard Rome designed for us on 12 cents. And the response from the audience was, sorry, you make me think about all this stuff I haven't thought about in years. I mean, it was overwhelming. And I've probably never been prouder of that moment because the company had been kind of languishing, but there was a pretty full house that night out of curiosity. Monday, of course, sold out based on the word of mouth. And it was and we followed that up with Cozy, with Brenda Harris, divine Brenda Harris. There was a Tosca that actually I had a guest director for. And my gosh, when we ended the season with Falstaff, which I also directed.
Wow.
So yeah, it was, but you know, it was all repertory I knew, thankfully. And yeah, I had 21 amazing years there.
How fantastic. How fantastic, Jay. You know, people must ask you for advice all the time.
Yes.
And I'm going to think of 2 categories of advice. You know, the advice for a singer, the advice for a stage director.
Yeah.
So, you know, young singer says, oh, you know, Mr. Lesenger, what do I need to know? What's the advice you give to the young singer?
The most fundamental thing I say to singers, and I know it sounds corny, to thine own self be true as an artist. I think the most difficult thing for young singers, you know, musicians are taught acting very different, if they're taught acting at all, very different from actors. Actors start here, singers start here, and they meet at the same place. So an actor is given text, and that's it. No rhythm, no pitch. They have to invent all of that on their own. And that's their process of putting their performance together. Singers, the opposite. They're given all of that. They're given the pitch, tempo, you know, text, all of it. But they have to make it feel as if it's spontaneous, as if they're creating it, not as if they're doing what's on the page. So I always said to singers, well, the other thing is, and I think you'll agree with this. What I have found with musicians is not just singers. Musicians are always told what not to do. It's a lot of no's when you're learning how to be a performer in singing. You're criticized incredibly. If you hold the note one hemi-demi semiquaver too long, you're told, no, that's too long. That's not Mozart. That's not Beethoven. There's a lot of no's that they have to carry around. And I tell them, I was given a very good piece of advice when I was in college, which is pick 1 or 2 people whose opinions you really trust and listen to them and say thank you to everybody else and block it out. Because as I said at Chautauqua, I always said, if you had 100 Chautauquans in the room, I'd get 105 opinions. That what I should have done or shouldn't have done. And that's too much weight. You can't perform that way. You've got to let all that go, take all the information that you get from your vocal coach, your voice teacher, your diction coach, all of that, the stage director, the conductor, and ultimately that's your foundation. Then you jump off of that. If the idea is that you're going to land on that, you're never going to enjoy what you're doing. It's not about making all of them happy. It's about taking the information you got from them and ultimately making yourself happy as a performer.
Mm-hmm.
So my thing is find out, start to understand what it is that you bring that's unique, and never let anybody drive that attitude. Never.
How about for the young stage director?
Young stage director, oh boy. You know, I consider myself, again, so enormously lucky for the years I was at City Opera, because what I learned there, to be in a house with that much repertory, and where I was actually given the opportunity to direct in that house, which does not happen very often with house directors. They may be given, at the Met, you're given a revival to stage, and the big houses, they'll use their staff directors when the show comes back. But it's very, very rare they get an opportunity to do even their own new staging on an old production or a new production. It's very, very rare. So I realized I had an opportunity that very few directors could get. What I advise directors to try to do is kind of hook yourself up to a director that you respect. If it's possible, try to get a chance to work with them on a regular basis. Interview with them. Maybe you assist somebody and they like you. Say, listen, can I continue to work with you? Do you want a permanent assistant? You may not get paid much money for it. You may have to survive somehow financially. But I think of a couple of directors who are out there now having big careers, and I know that part of it was because they were connected with a director who brought them from house to house to house. So they met the assistant production managers, the assistant stage managers, the assistant conductors, who 10 years later or 20 years later are now the conductors, the production managers, in those houses. And they build up those relationships that way. It's also a way, of course, of learning repertory. The other thing I say to directors is you have to watch things. You cannot learn in a vacuum. And I am astonished sometimes in my talk, occasionally with young directors, how little they've gone to see. Again, it's expensive, but now with video, there's so much stuff out there. You don't have to buy a standing room at the Met even. You can go to the HD if you have to, but go see things. Watch BBC from beginning to end. Every masterpiece theater you can. If you want to learn how to do period, they're the ones to learn it from. If you, just read history, study history, watch documentaries. I still do that. During COVID, all we did was, my partner and I was watch YouTube, because of all the historic material that's out there. It was fascinating. I learned more in those 2 years than I knew from the 40 years before. So it's exposure. Go to Broadway, see what's going on there. Go to off-Broadway, see what's going on there. Again, I had the advantage of growing up very close to New York City. And I lived in New York. No matter where I went in all my years, I still had my permanent home in the city. And whenever I was back in New York, I was going to the theater. So I think you just have to see as much as you can and find the right director to assist.
Any advice for the aspiring general director?
Why? But yes, I do have great advice. Have a meeting with Marc Scorca. No, I mean, I learned so much from being on the board. When you invited me to be on the board, that was a great honor to me at the time. I was the lowest budget company, I think, on the board at the time. And a chance to be in the room. What I realized is that everybody had the same questions, thoughts, concerns. It was just the number of zeros that were different.
Yep, absolutely.
So, and it gave me a chance to interact. There were a lot of producers there I knew because I had worked in their companies, which was great. Hearing other people, getting a sense of what was going out in the field. Chautauqua was a very unique place because I wasn't responsible for raising the money, which is a good thing in some ways, but a bad thing in another way, because they determined what my budget was from year to year. And, but I never had that pressure. But they gave me great artistic license. First of all, they trusted me. They knew I wasn't going to do something that everybody was going to hate. I don't think that's my job as a general director in a company like that, or a lot of companies, to produce things that the audience doesn't want to see, especially in rough times. And that's probably a controversial opinion right now, because we do need to have new work, obviously. But I still am for things that the audience wants to see, if it's new or old. And I remember in talking with one composer, I was working on a new piece, I said, I know you write melodies because I hear them in your orchestral work. Do the same thing when you're writing for the singers. And she didn't. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was, I didn't get that. You know, because I'm not sure the opera will ever get done again, you know, because,
Yeah.
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 So,
Well, Jay, we could go on
yes,
all day
and we
long.
have.
And I'm so grateful for this opportunity just to capture your starter stories of how
Mhm.
you got started. An important American stage director working with such a broad repertoire, and young singers and old. I really wanted to make sure we captured your story. So thank you
Oh, thank
so
you.
much for spending this time with me today. I will look forward to seeing you in person as soon as we can manage that. So let's be in touch on
Absolutely.
calendars. But again, thank you for all you've done for American opera, and thanks
Yeah.
for being with me this afternoon.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for asking. It means a lot to me. Thanks so much.
See you soon. Take care.
See you soon. Take care.